Welcome everyone to the second in our series of ACE Hub webinars. We've had about 400 registrations for this webinar, so there's clearly a lot of interest and thirst for knowledge out there. We'll give the laggards about another half minute or so to join us, and then we'll kick off. Doesn't the time go slowly when you're counting the seconds? Okay, I think we'll get started. So welcome everyone to Building a More Circular Australia, a webinar from the Australian Circular Economy Hub and PwC Australia. The ACE Hub's mission is to facilitate the transition to a circular economy in Australia by providing a platform for knowledge sharing and collaboration. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm standing today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, as well as the lands on which you are all joining us, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Today's webinar focuses on the benefits of shifting to a more circular economy, as highlighted in PwC's recently released report, Building a More Circular Australia, is presented by Dr. Lucas Carmody. Lucas is an urban economist who works as an associate director for PwC Australia. Lucas recently returned from a 2-year secondment with PwC Netherlands, where he was helping lead the Circular Economy Advisory Team. He's also just finished a project advising the Australian Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment, identifying incentives to support Australia's transition to a more circular economy and increase the use of recycled materials across supply chains. And just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. This event is being recorded. Please select gallery view in the top right-hand corner of your screen so that you can see everyone. And feel free to use the chat box throughout. But if you have a question for Lucas, be sure to use the Q&A box and we'll get to all of them later on. And I'll now pass over to Lucas.
Thanks very much. Appreciate the introduction and obviously appreciate the opportunity to present on behalf of PwC Australia and obviously for the Australian Circular Economy Hub. I don't think I'll try and do a better job of introducing myself. I think you've done a really good job, so I won't sort of fall flat in my face. But I will say that what I do is I essentially help private and government sector clients better understand the implications of complex infrastructure related projects and policies. And so what that means is taking more than an economic view of what the impacts of those projects may be. And so that means, having a look at what the social and environmental implications of those are. And so that's where the circular economy comes in from my perspective. So if I just go to what I'm going to talk about today. Today I'm going to talk to you about the economic case or the opportunity for Australia to transition towards a more circular economy. And as mentioned at the top, this comes off the back of a report that we modelled and estimated the impact of transitioning Australian industry towards more circular economic models and practices. I'm not going to go into the need to transition towards a more circular economy from an environmental perspective today. This isn't because I don't think it's incredibly important, but because of the condensed nature of today's seminar, but also because of probably the audience that's tuning in today is hopefully doesn't need to be convinced to do things a little bit differently. So instead, I'm going to focus on two things. The first is why go circular, and that's, as I mentioned, going to take an economic perspective and focus in on the modelling that we recently published. The second is I'll talk through a bit of a path forward for Australia. And it's a path forward, but it's partly informed by our modelling and what it's suggesting, but also our work recently with the federal government, and then also having a look at what lessons can be learnt from looking at other global jurisdictions, which are probably a little bit further down the path than we are at the moment. So why go circular? So what is the economic case or the opportunity from an Australian perspective? Essentially what we did with the modelling, and I won't go into it in a great deal of detail because not everyone loves economic modelling. But what we did look at is the impact of Australian transitioning towards more circular economic practices and models. There are a couple of things to flag before I do present some of the findings. The first is that we didn't measure the impact from a top-down view. Instead, we tried to view it from the bottom up. There are a few reasons that we did this. First is that a couple of reports, and there's not a shortage of them, that look at sort of the quantum of the opportunity from a whole of economy level. Whereas what we were really trying to do through our circular impact model is look at capturing specific outcomes, whether it be through changes in consumer demand, greater take-up of new technology, but also introducing industry incentives or even removing regulatory barriers. So it was really important for us to view what are the high priority initiatives, but then be able to trace the numbers back to actual actions. The second point is there that we didn't try to capture everything under the sun. What we tried to do is pick the high priority initiatives and then quantify them over a 20-year time frame between 2021 and 2040. So a circular economy model captures the direct benefits to households, industry, government, as well as the CO2 that could be reduced as well. We modelled this across the 4 categories that you can see there on the right, which is the built environment, mobility, community, and then some limited modelling around industry. And I'll get into why we did limited modelling around industry versus some of the other categories. I'll also provide, when I go through each of the categories, a vision of what a more circular built environment, mobility or community could look like. And then I'll give you some specific examples of high priority initiatives that we looked at in that category. So with the economic modelling out of the way, the interesting part, a circular built environment was one of the categories, as I mentioned. This looks at a scenario in which we have a built environment that's based on circular economy principles. So that means optimising land utilisation and integrating more durable mixed-use forms of buildings that are designed in a modular way and constructed with recycled and biological materials instead of virgin ones. It also is where we consume less power and water through the built environment and highly utilised thanks to the sharing and multi-purposing. So our analysis suggests that if city planning, modes of construction, real estate management could implement circular opportunities, this could generate $85 billion by 2040. This represents an average of 1.31% of gross domestic product each year over the next 20 years. So there's a fairly significant opportunity in the built environment, partly driven by the nature of the way that we deliver infrastructure in this country, but also the waste profile as a result of construction and demolition. An important thing to note when looking at the built environment is that it's not just about how we design and build the future. It's also about retrofitting and encouraging better use of the environment that we already have. And so what that means is incorporating circular opportunities into the built environment during the construction and throughout the asset life of buildings, so you can allow for optimal usage of construction materials, reduce utilisation of the finite resources that are used to build things, and hopefully substantially reduce the waste at the end of it. From our perspective, we looked at a few different high priority opportunities here. One of those was industrialised production of modules. So this is modular construction and off-site assembly, reducing some of the waste that occurs on construction sites. Another was 3D printing, again, targeting a similar problem. Sharing of building space, i.e. multi-purposing or multi-use buildings. And then the final one was high-value recycling and reuse of construction modules. So at the end of the life, getting something out of those products through looking at deconstructing rather than demolishing. So that's the built environment. If I look at the circular mobility sector, the benefits here are quite substantial, but not as large as some of the other ones we looked at. In this case, Australia has a mobility system that is interconnected and shared, electrified, autonomous and multimodal. Public transport under this scenario would make up the largest proportion of citizens' mode of travel, while individualised mobility would be mostly provided as a service. Our analysis suggests that more circular mobility system could create direct benefits of around $13 billion by 2040. And so they represent benefits across economic, social and environmental by reducing congestion, traffic accidents, fuel consumption, and along with some of the costs that are associated with each of those things. It also could potentially reduce CO2 by up to 144 million by 2040. And this is compared to business as usual projections. So adapting to a more circular mobility system requires technology, public infrastructure, and community attitudes to shift. This is potentially why it had a lower level of benefits compared to some of the other ones, because it already receives a great deal of attention from policymakers already. But the benefits are still fairly substantial. And we really prioritised here the increased use of personal electric vehicles, the adoption of connected and autonomous vehicles, and the use of intermodal transport systems, so really targeting that sort of last mile connectivity. So if I move to community, more circular communities looks at how Australian communities can become more mindful and informed of resource consumption, use and disposal behaviours. This leads to consumers reducing consumption of energy, water and biomass, and extend the life cycle of their assets for as long as possible and practice active recycling. The benefits here represent around 15 billion in 2040, or an average of 0.29% of GDP for the next 20 years. This would look at exploiting circular strategies at the household level, which could generate multiple benefits, minimising the use of finite resources, save costs associated with excessive consumption of electricity and food, and extract value from the recycled waste and substantially reduce CO2. We looked at a few different opportunities across this space. One of them was improving energy consumption attitudes, which is as simple as turning off the AC when not in use, unplugging appliances when not in use, sourcing low energy consumption fittings, for example, LED lights, and low consumption water fittings, faucets and shower heads, which is something that we already do quite well in this country. The other opportunity we looked at was sorting and recycling of materials, where there's a reasonably substantial opportunity to do better, whether it be water, organic, plastic, glass, paper and metal. And then the final one that we also looked at was around reducing food waste. The final one here was the circular industry, which looks at how Australian industry could work in a more circular manner by adapting the way that they do their business as usual, but essentially shifting to the way that they view waste as well. So viewing waste as potential value leakage. The limited analysis of circular industry suggests that we could generate around $801 billion over 20 years, which is obviously substantial. And so what that means in practice is circular industry adopts policies in the way that they work, in the energy they consume and the waste that they are producing. But it also provides the next wave of innovation to promote a more circular economy. And that's why we're seeing sort of fairly substantial benefits from this one. So the identification of circular opportunities depends on innovation here, and that's why the analysis of industry was limited. It's difficult to measure innovation or new ideas when they haven't happened to a large degree. And so therefore we looked at two relatively known opportunities in this space, and one of them was manufacturing switching from their base to renewable energy sources over coal and gas. And the second one is the production of green steel in replacing some iron ore exports for manufacturing overseas. So that's the opportunity. I think how we solve the problem, everyone's seen big numbers, and I think people get pretty exhausted by some of the numbers as well. I think actually how we solve the problem and realise these benefits, I think is probably the most interesting question. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a way forward going circular. So on this slide, we've got a fairly uninventive house diagram, but to set in motion the circular economy and reap the potential benefits, what we need in the first instance is a comprehensive national framework, which is required to ensure government and industry know what they're contributing towards, and have a consistent view of where the opportunities are from an Australian perspective. We lack a holistic approach for incentivising circularity in Australia at the moment. Some work's being done, but we lack a holistic framework right at the minute. So the figure on the screen at the moment illustrates what we view as the key pillars to facilitate Australia's transition. At the bottom of the pillar is the two core pillars of a national policy and plan. We already have a waste action plan, which is obviously agreed that all the states and industry have been involved in developing up that. I think we need something similar for the circular economy. I think we need to look at opportunities to move further up the waste hierarchy. I think we're doing a reasonably good job in this country about targeting waste. I think we just need to think a little bit more carefully about the design of the products that we're letting into the economy. So that's sort of where this sort of national policies and plans should be introduced. The second thing is in ensuring proper coordination and alignment between various entities. I think the realisation amongst a lot of states and territories at the moment is that it's more difficult to have a Victorian or a Queensland or a New South Wales circular economy. Fundamentally, businesses don't operate within single states, particularly in the areas where we're trying to target the most waste, the biggest wasters. And so therefore having coordination and alignment between the states, and that's facilitated at the national level, is fairly crucial. Pillars 3 and 4 are actually I guess opportunities or actions that have been outlined in the National Waste Policy Action Plan. And as was mentioned at the top, we were recently doing some work with the federal government in this space to identify financial and other incentives that may assist in the circular economy. But the core point here is that it needs to be supported by a national plan. There are a number of opportunities in that area around incentivising the right types of behaviours, whether it be fiscal frameworks, and so looking at opportunities to reduce or curb wasteful behaviours through taxes or levies or whatever it might be. And then the fifth one there is public awareness and outreach, and I think that's sort of acknowledged partly by the opportunities that I've outlined in the community area to reduce the waste, just by simply the community being more informed around their consumption habits. And the final one there is public procurement and asset management. I've left that that's been intentional. I think there's recognition that government, as a fairly significant economic buyer, has an opportunity to incentivise recycled materials and more circular practices in this country through mandatory green public procurement and other ideas like that. So how do we go circular? This is sort of where we should start. We believe that government and industry in the first instance should focus on driving 4 actions. And the first is a national circular economy framework. The second is developing market dynamics and incentives for change. So in the presence of market failure, free markets don't produce the efficient or even socially optimal outcomes that we want to get to a circular economy. And government needs to step in to regulate activities that lead to excessive negative externalities. So looking at some of those financial or other incentives. The third one there is creating markets for second-hand products and materials. So for a circular economy to work, there needs to be a market for the materials that we're creating. And so a challenge today is that not all second-hand materials are price competitive, and the price of virgin input materials are too low, and the markets for recycled materials may be too small. So a potential solution could be through industry changing the way that they look at turning waste into new input materials, but also looking at the opportunity around government as a significant buyer and actually integrating the true cost of materials, so social and environmental, into that price. The fourth and final one there is focus on infrastructure and the built environment. There's an unprecedented level of infrastructure being planned in this country, and that means that we have a significant opportunity to rapidly shift the way that the impact that this infrastructure will have on future generations, but also rapidly shift the built environment to more circular practices. So my final slide here is really just a PwC circular infrastructure framework, which is governed by 3 principles and 10 corresponding strategies, which are used to help guide infrastructure policy decision makers, as well as how industry in how they approach the design of our cities, infrastructure planning and business models. And I won't go through that in any great detail because I'm keen to get to questions. So I might leave it there and pass back to you, Rebecca.
Thanks very much, Lucas. That was really interesting. So now we'll open it up to questions from our audience, and we already have quite a few. From an anonymous attendee, hi, how will councils be prevented from expanding housing into arable farmland around our major cities and prevent the construction of sprawling cities with no infrastructure? Will the state approval process be made more robust, i.e. no building of new houses until the infrastructure is in place? This is a very live issue. I'm not sure it's one you can tackle in the remaining minutes we have, Lucas, but I'll hand it over to you anyway.
No, it's a good question. It's certainly a really, really difficult problem that a lot of local communities on the edge of some of our growing cities are facing at the moment. I think there's certainly examples across the globe where we've sort of drawn a fairly strong boundary around where we're willing to grow and where we're willing to not grow. I think that other countries have done it better purely by the nature of I guess a lot of things really. If you look at the Netherlands, for example, they really don't have a great deal of land available, and so they really need to make careful decisions around the use and the land use of land, particularly on the edge of their suburbs, and primarily due to I guess the value of agriculture as an export industry for the Netherlands. I think that's coming, and that burning platform is being felt in Australia even now, and I think a lot of councils on the edges of our major cities are already starting to think about just the environmental impacts of their development.
Thank you. Ken Fortin asks, on the mobility front, what are your thoughts on recent discussions, plans by various state governments to introduce a road distance travel tax on electric or hybrid vehicles, and the impacts that might have on the uptake of e-vehicles and developing and strengthening the circular economy?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's certainly something that a lot of the states and territories are starting to look at. I think for mine, you're looking to tax the things that you don't want, and you're looking to avoid taxing the things that you do want. And so I think if you look at the opportunities, particularly from an EV perspective in Australia, I think that's a significant opportunity to develop out a more circular mobility sector. So, if you're looking to essentially disincentivize the uptake of EVs, I would suggest that it's probably not getting us close to a circular economy.
Mm-hmm. Evan Kristen asks, please provide examples on some specific examples, expand on some specific examples of the waste stream circular economy under the community heading.
Yeah, so when we looked at the community heading, we were particularly focused in on a number of things there. We didn't try to measure everything, and we really tried to look at the size of the prize here. So we really didn't look at everything all the way down to specific recycled waste streams or materials. But what we did look at improving energy consumption attitudes. We looked at sorting and recycling of materials, and we really took a sort of high-level scenario of, again, sort of, I guess, what some of the baseline projections are around the uptake of, or some of the increasing consumption of water, organic materials, plastics, glass, and metal, and then assumed some fairly high-level forecast around reducing some of that consumption at the community level.
Mm-hmm. Caitlin Phillips Pedlesden, asks, does the modelling look at any social impacts? This is something you and I were discussing before we went live today.
Yeah, so the model doesn't look at some of the social implications of moving towards a more circular economy. I'd suggest that in some of the incentives that we looked at with the federal government, looking at some of the social costs of materials, looking at some of the environmental costs of materials, and integrating that into the way that we procure, whether it be industry or government, is certainly an opportunity to transition rapidly towards a circular economy. But yeah, no, our report didn't look at the social impacts, although I'd suggest that the numbers would get even larger and potentially a little bit more blurry for people to understand.
Indeed. And obviously this is very much in Planet Ark's bailiwick, the way in which individuals and communities react and interface with the circular economy. You talk about the need to change our buying patterns, embrace the sharing economy, the reuse economy, and the like. These are obviously fairly big challenges, and I guess government has a role to play here as well as industry to make it attractive to people. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think government is a massive economic buyer in this country, and if they sort of introduce something around mandatory green public procurement, but that support has to be supported by standards for products and recycled materials in products. So if you can have both of those things, you would make a fairly substantial step towards shifting towards a more circular economy. But on top of that, you would send a really direct signal to the market that this is the sort of behaviour, or this is the sort of things that we're looking to incentivise. So yeah, government's a massive buyer, and therefore if they sort of start to shift not only the things that they purchase, but also the footprint that they have as well, then industry will follow.
And I think that standards issue is an important one, not just government setting the framework, but also giving industry the confidence, and indeed consumers, because just anecdotally from the work that we've done over the decades, there is a little bit of resistance to buying secondhand, to using products that contain recycled content. There's an assumption that they're inferior in some way.
Yeah, for certain. I think equally there's a fairly significant push for people to, I think people are becoming more aware of their consumption impacts. And so therefore there's also a push from consumers to know what products and what impact those products are having. And so therefore, if you've got standards, not only can businesses understand better where their supply chain is having significant amounts of value leakage, but also from a consumer standpoint, you give them more confidence around the product that they're buying as well.
Yeah. I think that there's already a lot of stuff happening in the consumer space. I don't know that people necessarily understand that when they take an Uber or use a go-get car or get their food delivered by one of these food delivery companies, that they're actually engaging in the circular economy.
Yeah, which is the exciting part about all this. I think if that's happening without people making necessarily a conscious decision to do something from an environmental perspective, but also because it's commercially it makes more sense for their household, or even from a convenience perspective, then that's a good thing. That's essentially why I'm passionate so much about the circular economy, because not everyone is necessarily making the decision necessarily from a environmental perspective, which is great, and doing it from a purpose-led place, but it's also about if you can make commercial sense for a business, that's when you're really going to start to see some of the shifts. But also from a household level, if it's cheaper, if it's more convenient, that's where it gets really exciting.
Mm-hmm. And there are lots of ways in which, the material that we provide on the ACE Hub, but more broadly across Planet Arts programs, for people to understand the way in which they generate waste at the household level and also in their businesses, to really understand how to turn that tap off, or at least slow the flow.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what the ACE Hub is doing, particularly around promoting continuous dialogue and cooperation between stakeholders, is fairly crucial. I think the one thing that we have been lacking in this country to date is really just informing industry, informing consumers and the community around what a circular business looks like, for example, and bringing in some of those where other countries are already leading in this space, so we can quite rapidly catch up and hopefully overtake.
It must have been fascinating for you to spend that time in the Netherlands. They're really leading the pack in so many ways, aren't they?
Yeah, they certainly are. They do some things fairly differently in a variety of spaces, and not just in the circular economy. But it was really, really interesting. It was a really eye opener. Everything from just the level of information that communities provided. I thought I was being targeted with YouTube ads, but I think that was just a normal thing for people. I think that they get so much information around the products that they're using, what can and can't be recycled, but also just the number of different innovative startups, but also thinking about the way that they fund and finance social housing, for example, to transition away from what is a fairly energy hungry base of social housing in that country, and to more greener and circular practices. There's just a number of different things that we can learn from looking at the Dutch.
Fantastic. Look, a big thank you to you again, Lucas, for taking the time to present your findings from the report. A number of people in the chat have asked where to find the report. You can find it on the acehub.org.au website. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions. We'll be sharing the link to download the report, as well as the recording of today's webinar, in our follow-up email in the next few days. And to find out, as I say, about more upcoming events and explore inspiring case studies and read the latest circular economy news, please go to the website acehub.org.au. Finally, you'll see some questions appear when we end the webinar. We'd really appreciate your responses. Your feedback helps us to shape future events and projects. Thank you also to our funding partner, the Australian Government, and our foundation sponsors, Bingo Industries, Keep Cup, and Planet Art Power. And final thanks to everyone who joined us today, and all the best as you continue your journey towards circularity. Until next time, goodbye. We had a few technical difficulties in our live session earlier today, and we couldn't see a lot of your great questions. So Lucas is going to tackle them now. And the first one comes from Richard Fullylove. The question is, what are your thoughts on the relationship between CE and resilience, in particular supply chain resilience? Where are we seeing emerging threats to our supply chains due to political issues in the Indo-Pacific region? Will circular economy enable us to recycle, repurpose and reuse materials and assets to reduce external dependencies in certain areas? A big question for you, Lucas, there.
There's a bit to unpack there. Well, if I start with the circular economy, so the circular economy is a system that's restorative and regenerative by design and intention, and it's powered by renewable inputs. And so by the very nature of the circular economy or the solution that's proposing, it's essentially resilience planning, because good resilience planning looks at both the root cause of a problem, but then also anticipates the symptoms of that problem as well. And so from that perspective, if you're looking at it from a climate perspective, that's where the circular economy is actually quite an interesting solution to the climate challenge that we've got at the moment. So 45% of global emissions are made up by waste. And so by tackling that part of the problem and obviously the other 55% of the problem is looking at renewable energy. So the issue or from a supply chain resilience perspective, it's really important to think about where your supply chain is driven by virgin materials, where you're losing a lot of value from excessive waste issues. But we're already starting to see some of the impacts of a changing and variable climate on people's supply chains. I think recently I was reading somewhere that we ran out of peanuts, and then I think also if you look at the Asia Pacific, Taiwan have gone through a fairly significant drought, which led to them not able to produce microchips, which is affecting Apple's supply chain. So from that perspective, global companies are really looking at their supply chain from a resilience perspective, but that's where the circular economy comes in to help them plan for that resilience, because then they can look at where they can replace those, where they can replace materials that are used in the supply chain, particularly virgin ones, with bio-based or renewable materials, so that they don't run into those supply chain issues in the future.
Interesting. Tarek Haq asks, going circular requires a new consumerism culture. What would be the potential challenges to transform the current over-consumerism culture that exists in Australia?
Yeah, that's a particularly difficult one to address. I think you don't have to go far back before, in generations when the idea of waste not, want not was common practice. So from my perspective, in terms of changing that consumerism culture, it's relatively new in a sense, in the way that we sort of approach products. But I also think it's shifting. So from that perspective, what needs to be done is helping consumers with the complexity of products that they're engaging with now compared to previously. So that means disseminating better information and knowledge sharing. It also means raising public awareness around the impact of the products that they're consuming, so that they can make an informed decision around how they can shift to more sustainable, lower carbon, more circular practices in the household. And then I also think from that perspective, it's where there's an opportunity for government and industry to step in and look at standards around products, so that businesses know the impact of that material. Equally, looking at integrating the true cost of virgin materials into procurement decisions. So thinking about it from a social and environmental perspective, and not just from an economic perspective, so that consumers can then price, at least in their mind, the impact of some of their purchasing decisions.
Indeed. Patrick Manley wants to know, are there any good sources for predicted future material prices for disposable food containers? For example, are they likely to go up or down?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's certainly one that's basically, driving whether or not we can achieve a circular economy or not. Can we make the bio-based renewable materials price competitive with the virgin ones? If you look at plastics, as Patrick's suggested there, at the moment, COVID has had a massive impact on oil, which is obviously highly linked to the price of plastics, which has seen dramatic falls in the price of virgin plastics, and then put on pause some of the plastic recycling industry over the last couple of years. That's obviously had an impact on how we can shift to a circular economy. But if you take a longer term view, there's suggestions that oil prices will rise, and there's a number of studies that point towards that, including some great work by the CSIRO in that space. But essentially, there's suggestions that cheap oil sources will be essentially exhausted by 2040, but then also we'll be shifting away from oil as well. And so from that perspective, there's a potential there that if you look at the longer term trend, that recycled plastics will become mainstream, but also cost competitive. If you look at it from a price fluctuation standpoint, recycled plastics are quite stable. And from that perspective, from a business perspective as well, it means that you can forecast and make certain that the materials that you're using are going to stay around the same price as what they are now. But as technology improves, you'd suggest that the prices of recycled materials will continue to decrease. So from that perspective, it's looking reasonably positive.
And of course, if we're going to be substituting petrol-based plastics with bio-based ones, we're going to need the infrastructure to deal with those at end of life, or to get them back into circulation, aren't we?
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's kind of where, if you're looking where the investments are being made into that infrastructure, it's certainly not necessarily in new oil. It's really in looking at what we can do with the products that we have now, and then looking to where they can be used, reused again.
This question is from Ken Fullerton, who wants to know, do you have any knowledge of how recycled soft plastics, for example, through the REDcycle system, have been collected, diverted from landfill and reused in the manufacture of new products, for example, railway sleepers, park chairs, benches, etc. What other opportunities are there in that space?
So there's a lot of significant opportunities in that space. I think there was a Victorian manufacturer that was using soft plastics to make railway sleepers. If you look at the new rail investments in this country, but also some of the aging stock of rail in this country, there's a really massive opportunity to feed that supply into new infrastructure for rail over the next 10 years. There's a significant opportunity there, but then also I recently saw Nestle had their soft plastic food wrapper for their product. So, obviously for soft plastic packaging is a fairly significant and missing key link in Australia's waste management and opportunity to build a circular economy. So from that perspective, if you can use soft plastics to wrap chocolate bars, then obviously there's opportunities in the built environment as well, which don't have the same type of scrutiny and regulation around the products that they're introducing.
Sure. A final question for you. How is Uber part of the circular economy?
So it's a good question. So sharing platforms have the potential to significantly reduce the use of raw materials. So giving people convenient access to transport at any time, any place, replacing the hypothetical need for vehicle ownership, can reduce personal car journeys, congestion, solution, and road accidents. It's worth noting here that that's highly place-based, and depending on where you are in the world, will probably determine how impactful car sharing is as a circular circular solution. But the reality of the mobility space, the real opportunities aren't necessarily in car sharing. I would suggest that they're more in the use of clean and renewable energy for transport modes, for mass transit, I should say, but then also increasing the use of mass transit, and then not to forget active transport as well. Getting more people on bikes, getting more people walking to work, not only has environmental impacts, but also social ones and health ones as well.
A great reminder for us all to end on. Lucas, thank you again so much for your time. And to all of you who joined us for the session, thank you for your great questions. And don't forget to go to acehub.org.au for more information.